Okay, and we're live here for our third episode of American Spirits. And this time we're moving on to another book. We could continue talking about Albion's Seed because there is so much in there, but we do need to move on and discuss other books of interest. So today, the book we are reading is The American Language by H.L. Mencken. And joining us this week, we have our first guest from outside the club, the Old Glory Club, and that is, of course, Semiogogue. Welcome, Mr. Semiogogue. Thank you for coming on.
It's my pleasure to be here, gentlemen. Always happy to talk with you. And yeah, your club is taking over all my friends. They're everywhere. It's like an army. But yes, very happy to be here. This is a subject close to my heart. I'm very happy to have the invitation and the opportunity to discuss Mencken, and as well as this subject of our American language.
Yes, and of course I'm joined as always by my co-host Ryan. How are you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing pretty good. Hope that you guys are doing well as well, because it's not often I get a chance to just read through Mencken for something productive. Usually it's just a private enjoyment, but thankfully this week I got to really dig into him, and there's some really fun stuff in this book. Beyond just Mencken's writing style, he has a whole bunch of information that we're going to be going through.
Yeah, Mencken is quite funny. I enjoyed reading the book a lot. I especially liked the first, let's say, roughly 100 pages where he's really throwing a few slings at some of the critics from Great Britain who are arguing against the American language. And I found that very amusing. He's just got a very good writing style. So, excellent read. We haven't read through the whole book. We've read through, let's say, the first half. That's the only bit we're going to be covering. These aren't book review streams, they're discussion streams. And of course, as Semiogogue mentioned, we invited him on because he is an expert on the matter of language in many ways, in fact, ways I don't even understand. So we are expecting good insights from you, sir. But with that,
I hope I can deliver. Yeah. I should say I'm no. It's kind of you to say I'm an expert, but you probably have just agitated a storm of dissension with that.
No, I was kind of gassing you up to get that exact response, knowing you'd respond that way. But anyway, let's get into the subject matter because we do want to try and keep these streams between about 90 minutes and 2 hours so that they're more listenable. That's our goal. So Ryan, or actually, let's give some general thoughts on the book first. We'll give it to our guest first, Semiogogue. If you have any general thoughts on the book you'd like to put forward, feel free to do so before we start making explicit references.
Well, Ryan has already covered the basic idea that I certainly think needs to be seconded, which is that Mencken is just an excellent writer. He's someone who cut his teeth writing every single day for decades within the newspaper and the trade of journalists of his day. And he's certainly a member of that class, a cultural critic, as he's often described, who does not, I think, deserve the kind of opprobrium that so-called journalists today certainly do. He's a brilliant stylist in his own way. I mean, he has a bit of fun with it, throwing in words that that one is not entirely ready for. He used one, I recall I had to look it up. It was omphalo-psychic, which or something along these lines. And basically it translates as navel gazers. So there's quite a bit of that sort of backhanded or oblique chiseling and criticism that you find in his work. He's really excellent. The adjective for him is mordant, biting. And it's very interesting to see the way in which his book was supported through the various editions by all of the people who read his work in the papers and the rest and bought the first edition of the book, and then became kind of his own little private army, sending in information that informed the fourth edition, which of course ballooned to some size. And in certain ways, that in itself is a reflection on how certain things happen in America outside of the academic environment. In his early chapters, he talks about how there's been little support for looking into the American language, such as it is, through academic institutions and projects supported by those institutions. But as soon as someone with the reach of a Mencken publishes a book in his excellent style, you find that there are all these people who are mobilized both across the Atlantic and here in the United States to ferret out all sorts of really, really interesting little gems that he includes in the text. And so to some extent, you can say that what he put together there was a collective effort. It's just really, really a great book, and it should be underscored again what a great writer and social critic Mencken is or was.
Yeah, and I have to agree wholeheartedly with your sentiment there. Just because as I continue to write, Mencken is like the ideal I aspire to, but that I know that I will not be able to reach. Mencken has a talent that far surpasses everyone else's of just casually destroying whoever he's arguing against with just like a side comment. I don't know how he does it. I don't know if it came naturally to him or if he cultivated it. I don't know if he deliberated over his words for hours on end or whatever else. But he could just he could make you laugh at whoever it is he's arguing against, even if you've never heard of the guy. It's a very rare talent. Certainly, few writers today have the ability. And then the other things that he does well, sort of in his writing style throughout the book, is that Mencken does a great job of putting forth a hero or a group of heroes and then villains. It's very clear that Mencken is a sort of pro-American in terms of language. He does not think much of the uppity critics across the waters in England, which is the sort of group of villains in the book. But not only does he not think much of them, he makes sure that you also share his opinion by sort of just making them look silly. It's a talent that I unfortunately do not possess. But something else that I think might be interesting, at least for the audience, for anyone that might be interested in following along or getting the book list as we go through it, is that this the only reason I knew that these books existed, The American Language by H.L. Mencken, is because I went through a local bookstore and they just had a used set on the shelf, and I saw it had Mencken and The American Language, thought it'd be cool, and I bought it. I just started flipping through the book, and what Mencken does throughout a good chunk of the book is that he just lists words that are Americanisms, things that were made here in America, things that words that the Americans changed the definitions of, or the use of, or perhaps words that survived over here but died out in Europe. And I remember this would probably be about a year and a half to 2 years ago. I was just flipping through the book and I was marveling at just the amount of words that are so commonplace in at least my form of English that I speak. And I was just wondering how would I speak without these words? There's so many of them. And then that's basically the whole book. He's a fountain of information, and I don't know how long it would have taken him to come up with this information in the time of typewriters and paper libraries. This is a sort of a feat that I don't know. With all of our technology today, I'd be surprised if someone came up with something as good as this. That's how I put it. Maybe that's too grandiose, though.
Well
I
said.
certainly don't think so.
The sheer number of references to synonyms for various words or examples of some particular suffix or prefix being used or pronounced in a certain way in all of these different categories, it's really remarkable. One can scarcely imagine how there can be so many different ways to speak things in the American language, and that is a phrase he uses very deliberately as opposed to the English language, and one I am of a mind to actually start using when speaking of how we talk to each other. I like this concept of using American because it is actually quite distinct, and it's not as distinct as it's much more distinct than you realize, at least than I realized, simply by going through this book and looking at the histories of these various words and pronunciations and the sheer number of them. It practically fills a small dictionary. But anyway, also someone in chat had mentioned my mic sounded scratchy, so I untangled the wire. Let me know if it still is, and if it is, I'll switch to my internal mic, which I know works. But if it's fine, we'll continue. And in any case, let's start pulling up some particular references. And actually, before we do that, I'll remind the audience that you can super chat on Entropy and, of course, on YouTube. And we'll get to them at the end of the stream and respond to anything, any questions or anything you might say. So, yeah, what is the first reference you'd like to bring up, Ryan?
Okay, so this is the first screenshot in the folder that I sent in, and so as I mentioned in sort of in the overview, Mencken has a very great way of pointing out villains and heroes in his narrative, and this will become clearer as we continue. The American language is distinct and is the way it is due to many reasons, some of which is just the fact that English, so the language spoken in England, was sort of standardized from the top down. There were many movements trying to regulate the use of speech, standardize it, formalize it, that did not exist over here in any real capacity. Certainly not anything approaching the depth of English regulation. So if I'll just read this, I'll read this out very quickly, and you can sort of see what this underlying conflict that Mencken's pointing out here, the English impulse to sort of standardize and regulate versus the American more organic language that formed over here. So Mencken writes, in England, all branches of human endeavor are alike bent to the service of the state, and there is an alliance between society and politics, science and literature that is unmatched anywhere else on earth. But though this alliance on occasion may find it profitable to be polite to the Yankee, and even to conciliate him, there remains an active aversion under the surface, born of an incurable rivalry between the two countries, and accentuated perhaps by their common tradition and their similar speech. Americanisms are forcing their way into English all the time, and of late they have been entering at a truly dizzy pace, but they seldom get anything properly describable as a welcome, save from small sects of iconoclasts, and every now and then the general protest against them rises to a roar. As for American literature, it is still regarded in England as somewhat barbaric and below the salt, and the famous sneer of Sidney Smith, though time has made it absurd in all other respects, is yet echoed complacently in many an English review of American books. So this is, I think, what most people in our audience would be readily familiar with. The English look down upon the American language. They see it as a corruption, an aberrant twist. This is a degeneration of a polite society, and this was the exact same thing that they have held. This view is the exact same they've held since the 1820s, the 1920s, and then today in the 2020s. So I figured this would be like a good jumping off point. It kind of captures Mencken's villains, which are the top-down regulators of the English language, the non-organic, crown-subsidized smotherers of anything cool in the language, if you will. And it sort of sets up that versus the American organic, vulgar, but also genuine language as it develops with the country. And also it provides a nice overview that the English really do not like the American language. This is a very common sentiment that still persisted to this day. So that was what I wanted to pull out of here. If you guys have anything to add.
Well, I do,
yes.
If I may.
Yes, you go first.
Well, I mean, there's a bit, I think it's on page 11 of the digital edition you were kind enough to send over to me. And it says, in July 1800, the monthly magazine and American Review of New York printed an anonymous denunciation headed "On the Scheme of an American Language," of the notion that, quote, grammars and dictionaries should be compiled by natives of the country, not of the British or English, but of the American tongue, end quote. The author of this tirade, who signed himself C, displayed a violent Anglomania. The most suitable name for our country, he said, would be that which is now appropriated only to a part of it. I mean New England. And so you could see at this early stage, 1800, this, generations before the war between the states, you have this fundamental division in the United States. And I don't want to get off into political aspects and theorizing about national subversion, but there clearly is a group of people who were, entirely focused on Britain as the cultural standard, and who seemed to be, in many respects, upset about the fact that we severed ourselves to the extent we did from Britain. And so that's a theme that we're going to see throughout this book, this idea of Anglomania and this group of people in the North, the Yankee. And note that Brits call all of us Yankees, which I find repulsive, because that is where their connection is. It's to the northeast of the country. And that's where you get, quite a number of different Puritan sects. And of course, up until recently, the better part of the survival of what we call the Episcopal Church in the United States. Many of these ties with England. And you, of course, have, families with money who marry into British ones. So there's an aspect of this fight over our language that has to do with either maintaining or continuing to sever the ties that bound us to Britain. And we have seen that since, we talk about things like a special relationship and all of this other stuff. There have been, certainly with World War II, which occurred after this book, this 4th edition was published, I believe, or there were some updates of it that were around that time. But the point is that we've only grown more tightly bound up compared to our previous history with Britain. I mean, for quite some time, we have huge amounts of Germans who settled this country, and French and the rest, and Dutch. And there's this idea that, we should remain tied to Britain. On this, another point, you talked about how there hasn't been this sort of top-down attempt to impose an accent. That's partially true. We don't have anything like received pronunciation, but there was the so-called mid-Atlantic accent that was taught to radio broadcasters and actors in the U.S. when, during that period when radio and film came to the fore. And that was certainly an artificial accent, and it was designed to be a neutral form of speech that would not alienate or show too much favor towards any particular U.S. region, which had its own ways of speaking. They also called it the mid-Atlantic. They called it the transatlantic accent as well, which shows, again, this sort of idea of imposing a standard from above. One last thing I'll point out is that, the Brits, they like to talk about how they have the real English, and whatever it is that we have is some sort of strange doggerel. But I expect you guys will be making a similar argument. To me, I think it's very clear that 17th century English that we started with had a sort of dauntless spirit of experimentation and the forming of new words. This whole period with the Elizabethan period, that was a time of great experimentation. Spelling was not standardized. Words would be coined based on Greek or Latin models. And of course, this is the period when the English, or if you prefer now to say the British, they produced their finest works of literature. It was during this very sort of rough and tumble period of experimentation before everything was fixed. And so I would argue that we are the inheritors of that we are certainly arguably more truly in that tradition. People like to think, oh, well, we came over to the New World, and at that point it became this separate thing that was disconnected from its roots. No, here I would argue the roots and the attitudes about it were in large part preserved. I mean, take a look at this expression that drives me mad that the Brits favor, which is different too. It makes me insane. When you have different from, you have the sense of withdrawing. You're coming from, you're moving away from, and you say similar to, because you're moving towards. There's a harmony in the words to form the phrase. Imagine someone saying that we were similar from. It's absurd. And if you take a look at, because I bothered to do this, I took a look at the Google Books Ngram Viewer just to see different to and its use in British English. And it really starts up in the early 1800s and peaks in relative frequency around the middle of the 20th century. So this whole ass backwards idea of saying different to, which you'll hear all the Brits just sort of, like as they chew their cud, they mindlessly repeat it. It's widely accepted in British English, except it's a new innovation and it's an asinine one. So there are many ways, and Mencken goes through a number of them, that we can, apply the hammer and tongs to the British for this language that they claim to preserve. But that's just, one example. So you could see we have our problems too, in terms of, new coinages and barbarous neologisms and the rest. But I think there's a strong argument to be made that we are the proper inheritors of the spirit of the language of the period when it was most fecund, when it was most fruitful in terms of producing works of real literature that are celebrated to this day.
Well,
Yeah, and
I want to go back to what I wanted to say combines well with the first point you made a few minutes ago in regard to the Anglomania and this idea to fix the language in the English form rather than the American form. What I wanted to comment on was this whole idea of the English trying to fix their language into a completely static, unchanging form that they defined and controlled strikes me as a sort of reactive element to the fact that their empire was presently falling to pieces in their hands, and attempting to control and fix the global language that everyone would end up using, as we can see now. It replaced the lingua franca of French at the which was used diplomatically by most European nations beforehand, and even some Asian nations. This whole thing strikes me of a sort of related to the fear of losing control, and then tying that into the third point you're making. The fixture that they're trying to set in place isn't even the original form anyway. Mencken does give us several examples, many examples actually, of how many Americanisms are actually recycling of older, more archaic English terms that came back into use in America. And as we demonstrated in the previous book, the American peoples were originated out of the English culture. So there's no reason to say why the English people couldn't be the inheritors of the English language. And there's also nothing wrong with the idea that we would create our own language that we might call American, that Mencken does call American. After all, the Latin language is dead now, but there are many languages that stemmed out from it. And the fact that one language is born out of another or many others, especially with the case of American, doesn't make it some sort of invalid concept. Ryan, I'll pass it to you.
Oh yeah, and I was just going to say throughout all of this, there's something more pernicious, especially earlier on. Probably not as much now, considering that the people that still really care about this and denigrate the Americans aren't as aligned with state power, shall we say. But early on, there was a very strong movement within British society to sort of delegitimize any notion of an independent and sovereign American people. This was, in fact, Mencken goes into this very briefly, but only tangentially, that there was a long wave of assaults on American sovereignty and upon their heritage, their language, their political independence, all the way up until about the end of the War of 1812, in which case that dies down. It hit its peak before that. But this is you have to find it very interesting that you had a lot of the British state aligned almost unanimously in denying that America had its own language, that it had its own culture, and all these other things. It was it's somewhat sinister looking back at it. And this is like I said, that is not really the British foreign policy anymore, so it's not as state aligned. But one does have to question if someone is denying that the Americans have their own language, that's rooted in history, it comes from their own heritage, which itself is from older English peoples. One has to ask why are they doing that? Why are they trying to denigrate us? It seems ever so slightly subversive.
Yeah, and look at the way in which language is used on us today by our own masters here in the United States, who, pushed things through the, Modern Language Association and through various style guides, and now increasingly through LLMs and the rest, where everything has to have some sort of special codicil attached to it, indicating that you recognize, like I was pulling up summaries through LLMs about Mencken and his life, and they're very careful to add in little notes about how because of his period, his statements about race would be considered insensitive today, or think about the way in which we're constantly enjoined to change the terms that we use to refer to a particular group. We'll oscillate between words that mean black or colored. First, black is bad in one version, and then it's colored, and then colored is bad, and we have another version of black. Everyone, I'm sure, can grasp what I'm talking about. Or even the way in which our millennials and younger generations have this revolting habit of upspeak. You create a situation where everyone is uncertain about whether they are speaking correctly, and so everything is presented with hesitation. And that's it's a bit old-fashioned to say this, but it's unmanly for a person to speak in a questioning way at all times. Imagine schools of rhetoric where everyone was trained to be hesitating and uncertain whenever they address the public on a matter of critical importance. And I believe that there are ways in which these things are tied, as you suggested, Ryan, that there is a subversive dimension. Whenever an American opens his mouth, certainly abroad, it's supposed to be imagined that he should be hesitant, that he should be careful, because he does not, in fact, own his language. He is a kind of a parasite or a hanger-on, when in fact that entire idea is absurd. And I would prefer, personally, to see more people in my country speaking with authority and not raising their voice at the end of every sentence in order to create out of it a question. And it seems to me, one last point, that we see that inculcated in Britain with the idea of phrasing everything as a question so as not to be seen as impolite. The British, it seems to me, are the true innovators in terms of teaching certain classes of people always to speak as though it's a question. There's a sense in which I can get behind that, because among aristocrats, where you might duel or kill each other, though the Brits were not very well known for that, the French much more so, you would want to remain polite. There's the old expression, the best way to stay out of trouble is to keep a civil tongue in your head. So to some extent, I can see why there would be, sort of an oblique approach, or why you would wish to knife someone rhetorically in a way that seemed like a mild question. But as a general rule, the idea of phrasing everything as a question it signals to me a people uncertain of themselves.
The subject matter of the book, the central conflict that Mencken is writing about, the American language versus the English language, really must be understood not as an argument or debate about which is more correct, although there are certainly many debates within the context of the book and the topic in general that one could have in that regard, such as the example of different from, different to, etc. But really, what's happening here, what's being described in this book, is a power conflict between elite groups. The same way we would comprehend pretty much any other argument between great powers. This is really nothing more than that conflict playing out at root in the level of language itself. Now, with that said, why don't we grab another reference, because we have a lot of them. I don't expect to get through all of them as we're now beyond seed, but let's find something else to discuss. So what shall we look at next?
I've been looking through them so I can cut them down just a little. Let's go to number 5, TAL 5. So this is a quote where Mencken has found Just so that people don't think that we're taking small things and running with it, this whole book is full, especially in the first section, of British just ripping apart the American language. They think it's the worst thing to ever happen in some cases. So Mencken writes here, quote, "This Britain, as usual, was as full of moral horror as of grammatical disgust, and put his denunciation upon the loftiest of grounds. He concluded, I will not go on with this unpleasant subject, nor should I have alluded to it, but I feel it something of a duty to express the natural feeling of an Englishman at finding the language of Shakespeare and Milton thus gratuitously degraded. Unless the present progress of change be arrested by an increase of taste and judgment in the most educated classes, there can be no doubt that in another century the dialect of the Americans will become utterly unintelligible to an Englishman, and that the nation will be cut off from the advantages arising from their participation in British literature. If they contemplate such an event with complacency, let them go on and prosper. They have only to progress in their present course, and their grandchildren bid fair to speak a jargon as novel and peculiar as the most patriotic American linguist can desire." So that's probably the fieriest denunciation of the American language that was in the first part, or at least one of. But this is interspersed in about a dozen or so quotations that Mencken had found from literary critics of the time, roughly around 1800 to 1840, and then some more modern ones at his time, so earlier on in the 20th century. It is very clear that the British literary class, the people that had this idea that they were entrusted to guard the language and keep it pure, they really disliked American. It was seen as a sort of mortal terror, an existential threat to their existence. So that was I figured that would be good here, just to show that we aren't taking things and running with them, but there was this sort of extreme reaction to the Americans having a different form of English.
And there's quite a bit of coping and seething. On page 13 in a footnote, there's a quote from one Sidney Smith, and it says, "In the four quarters of the globe, who reads an American book?" This is from 1820. Or goes to an American play, or looks at an American picture or statue? What does the world yet owe to American physicians or surgeons? What new discoveries have their chemists, what new substances have their chemists discovered? Or what old ones have been analyzed? What new constellations have been discovered by the telescopes of Americans? What have they done in mathematics? Who drinks out of American glasses, or eats from American plates, or wears American coats or gowns, or sleeps in American blankets? They're, this is a quote that should be thrown back into their laps today, as they say to each other, "Hey, dude, what's up?"
I'll just throw one in as well. It's a little lighter, but this one is between Noah Webster, of course, of education and dictionary fame, and Captain Basil Hall from Great Britain, and they're arguing about whether or not new words should take up their place in the language. So Webster says that, quote, "If a word becomes universally current in America where English is spoken, why should it not take its station in the language?" To this, Hall made an honest British reply, because, he said, there are words enough already. I thought that was just an interesting exchange, because I think it really highlights the difference between the Americans, the people who came over from across the sea, and the people in Great Britain, where in the British mind there's enough already to satisfy whatever needs arise, whereas in America you have this concept of expansion, and that there isn't simply enough in general. There's not enough words, there's not enough territory, there's not enough of whatever it might be. So this attitude towards innovation in language, I think, reflects in some ways on innovation in general and how it's viewed from the British Isles and on the American side. There's another funny one on the same page. A man named Marriott. It says in the book, he toured the United States 10 years after Mr. Hall. quote, was chiefly impressed by the American verb to fix, which he described as universal and meaning to do anything. It also got attention from other English travelers, including Godfrey Thomas Vinn, whose 6 Months in America was printed in 1832, and Charles Dickens, who came in 1842. Dickens, in a letter, wrote this, quote, this is sort of mocking the concept of to fix. So, quote, I asked Mr. Q on board a steamboat if breakfast be nearly ready, and he tells me yes, he should think so, for when he was last below, the steward was fixing the tables, in other words, laying the cloth. When we have been writing, and I beg him to collect our papers, he answers that he'll fix 'em presently. So when a man's dressing, he's fixing himself, and when you put yourself under a doctor, he fixes you in no time. The other night, before we came on board here, when I had ordered a bottle of mulled claret, and waited some time for it, it was put on the table with an apology from the landlord, a lieutenant colonel, that he feared it wasn't properly fixed. And here, on Saturday morning, a Western man, handing his potatoes to Mr. Q at breakfast, inquired he wouldn't take some of these fixings with his meat. So there you go. I thought that was a little amusing because, well, this is a word we still use commonly in this exact universal way today to fix and have fixings and fixing to. So I'll throw that in the ring. Ryan, you were about to speak up, though, before I continue on there.
Oh, I was just going to say, you find this a lot where there's a pattern where the Americans have some cool word because the American language it still has vitality. It's still growing, developing, and adapting to the things around it. It's not sort of mummified artificially from political forces. And what happens is the British balk at it, think this is such a funny thing. They begin using it while denouncing it, and then sometimes the things that they're denouncing it, the words they're denouncing it with, are themselves Americanisms, which is if we could pull up the seventh photo that I have of the book, and this is, I'll just go through this very briefly because I can't describe the pattern any better than Mencken can. He says, in the field of language, an Americanism is generally regarded as obnoxious ipso facto, and when a new one of any pungency begins to force its way into English usage, the guardians of the national linguistic chastity belabor it with a great vehemence and predict calamitous consequences if it is not put down. If, despite these alarms, it makes progress, they often switch to the doctrine that the word, is really Old English, and search the Oxford Dictionary for examples of its use in Chaucer's time, or even in the Venerable Bedes. But while it is coming in, they give it no quarter. Here the unparalleled English talent for discovering moral obliquity comes into play, and what begins as an uproar over a word sometimes ends as a holy war to keep the knavish Yankee from undermining and ruining the English culture and overthrowing the British Empire. So this is the sort of pattern that Mencken is noticing, going through who knows how many books, newspapers, magazines, and journals researching this, where the English hate it just because it's American, that it's just known on the face of it that since the word originated with the Americans, it must be wrong, barbaric, degenerated, and whatever other words you want to throw in there. And then as people start to use it more, they switch. And suddenly, oh, well, of course, this word isn't Americanism. This originated in our isles in the High Middle Ages. You can find it in the Oxford Dictionary. And then, as he points out later on in this quote, he just says, and almost as often, the denunciation of the new word is sprinkled with genuine Americanisms unconsciously picked up. So this is something where the purists, the purists cannot speak a pure English at this point, and especially in the modern day, but definitely when Mencken was writing. There are so many words that have their meaning because of the American influence on the language, that to speak a purer English would just, it doesn't come naturally anymore. Even deliberately, it would be difficult to speak. And I have some selections of words later on, but this is just a problem that any anti-American purist of the English language is going to have. It's not going to sound like English. It's going to sound very hobbled, if you will.
Yeah, I would say, because this is a subject of some importance to me, that I think, anyway, we should be careful about being too broad in our strokes in terms of damning the impetus or the tendency or the desire for conservatism in language. Certainly, being conservative about your language is not something constrained to the British of the 18th or 19th century. It's something that we should, I think, be concerned about here in America today. Of course, there are the major divisions, or the major division between the written language, which acts as a kind of conservative place. We write more, we write differently in general from how we speak, although that is changing certainly with the use of OMG and RU and the rest that comes with social media and typing on keyboards and emojis, which in themselves are a threat to literacy. So there are aspects of the subversive use of a conservative tendency to try to keep Americans in their place, where I certainly agree that that's suboptimal, and we shouldn't tolerate it. We shouldn't have then, and we shouldn't today. But there are other respects in which I think we should try to be conservative, certainly in our written language, to the extent that we can be without being ridiculous. The most important lesson that I've learned in my life relative to this subject, well, the second most important, is that we should be very, very careful of recklessly introducing new words where we have a whole selection of them that serve perfectly well, and that we should stay away from, abandoning any efforts to conserve our language as it stands, because the price we pay for this is the loss of our own literary heritage, our own, written linguistic heritage, the written corpus of our culture. It will become more and more incomprehensible to us. Once upon a time, people simply read Shakespeare, and then you had versions of Shakespeare that had copious footnotes because there are different expressions and ways in which English was used at the time that are, not within our living memory. But now what we have are attempts to rewrite, to bring it down to date, as Mark Twain would have said, because it's a very different thing from bringing it up to date. It's a degradation. And we no longer have the stabilizing influence of Latin and Greek as a sort of anchor or a ballast for our knowledge of things. Because Latin, as some wit once said, is not a dead language but a deathless one. And so to educate someone in Greek and Latin meant that they had a fixed foundation that would serve again as a kind of ballast as they grappled with other changes in their vulgar tongue, their national tongue of this later period that was still changing. So how can one be conservative in the only meaningful sense if one does not resist this process of what I think of as self-disinheritance? Yes, you can't prevent linguistic change. It's going to happen. It will. But death, too, is something that we can't prevent. But we don't hear anyone saying that we shouldn't put off our death for as long as possible by being prudent. And I will say this, on the one hand, we can and should make fun of the BBC for having a pigeon page, which is disgusting beyond measure. But we should be fighting within our own country, against rap speak and Nicki Minaj lyrics and emojis and all the rest. So that's just a point I want to bring up here, is that the conservative tendency as such, it shouldn't dominate. And the British examples of attempting to impose it subversively on the U.S., are objectionable. But I don't think that we should simply, and I'm not saying anyone was really saying this, I just want to make it clear for anyone who might be listening, the conservative influence upon a language should be a part. It should be one of the things that we deal with as the language hopefully develops rather than devolves.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
the particular
that's a very
issue
good point.
that Mencken is grappling with is that in this case, the so-called conservative element is actually a foreign power attempting to subvert the natural development of the American language and people. And that's the core issue. It's not the conservatism inherently. So it's very important we make this point, and fairly early in the stream, that we're not attempting to undermine all conservatism in language, but not all innovation is destruction either. Or sorry, uh, not all innovations are non-destructive. So there are obviously language will change inevitably, but there has to be a conservative impulse trying to protect it, because now it is the language we speak is our language. No one could possibly debate that. The American version of English, or we'll just say American language, dominates in the world today, and the extent to which we allow present foreigners to undermine it, which is happening, actually damages our heritage. Now, Mencken goes through many of the Spanish, Dutch, French, German, and even older English and Scottish influences in our language, but these were all part of the developmental process of the nation. The nation has been fully developed now in terms of who we are as a people. We have a clear identity. There is a clear concept of what an American is. And now we must set out to protect that. One of the things that the author Mencken points out, as did actually the author in Albion's Seed, Mr. Fisher, although we did not, I don't think we actually referenced this, but this idea of words coming into usage from the black population is actually something that's been grossly overstated. I made a few funny examples, I think, towards the end of our last Albion's Seed stream, but that influence is actually very minimal in American history, basically until the present time. And now in our present time, we do have to actively resist these subversions. And there are also the words that come into our language now seem to stem from nowhere. I'm not really sure where they come from, but as Semiogogue mentioned, there used to be a basis for in Latin and Greek, and a lot of the new words would come from appending or prepending existing syllables and suffixes from various languages in the European tradition onto existing words. And there was a sort of logic to how these words came into usage, especially when the Industrial Revolution fully kicked off in America, and there were all these new jobs and positions that had to be defined. This created a boundless array of new words into the language, and that's fine, but there are now foreigners who are undermining the language, and we do have to stop this from happening. Anyway, Brian.
Look, yeah, I mean, this is the only reason that I bring this up and keep hammering this, especially for the first half of the stream, is to counter one particular sort of online traditionalist type that became very popular probably about 4 or 5 years ago, that basically views anything that has happened after like 1500, including the entire American nation being born out of England, as being subversive and modernist. The whole point here is that you have a foreign power trying to undermine you, and they're pulling out all of the stops that we might hear from an online traditionalist at this point in time. And perhaps we can learn from this historical event and develop an immune response to it, an immune system response to it. The point not to take away is that we just have to pursue some sort of like linguistic absurdism for the sake of it, just despite conservatism. That's not the thing to take away here. The thing to take away here very much is to understand why different groups might be trying to undermine the existence of an American people and the American language. Two of the basic criterions for a people being a nation. So you guys are absolutely correct on this. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit why this is being hammered home, sort of to counter a more subversive, pseudo-traditional tendency that has become popular recently. Did we want to comment any more on this before moving on?
No, why don't you reference another page for us?
Okay, so if we go to 8, we can start delving into some of the words. And I was going to say I apologize if this is boring, but I actually don't, because this is kind of fun to see which words were considered Americanisms actually are, how the meanings changed and whatnot else. So I'll just read this out because I find it interesting. Mencken says, It is his own, yet not his own. It seems to him a caricature of English, a phantom speech, ghostly yet familiar, such as he might hear in a land of dreams. Mr. Whibley objected violently to many characteristic American terms, among them to locate, to operate, to antagonize, transportation, commutation, and proposition. These words, he said, if words they may be called, are hideous to the eye, offensive to the ear, meaningless to the brain. The onslaught provoked even so mild a man as Dr. Henry W. Boynton to action, and in the Bookman for March of the same year, he published a spirited rejoinder. So this is pro-American, sort of countering this specific English onslaught on the American language, where he says, "It offends them, the English," he said, "that we are not thoroughly ashamed of ourselves for not being like them." Mr. Whibley's article was reprinted with this counterblast so that readers of the magazine might judge the issues fairly. So this is the whole point. This was recognized. The things that we've been saying this whole stream were recognized at the time. The Americans did have their own defenders who readily recognized that this was a sort of foreign power trying to impose itself on us and make us feel ashamed for not being like them, if you could imagine such a thing. Any thoughts and comments?
No, I mean, I think the point stands for itself. I'll add some ways that I found interesting in terms of how we actually do differ from them. So let's see, page 144 here. There was a particular bit Mencken wrote about how Americans will take these sort of shortcuts in their language and create rather vivid or bold combinations. He particularly uses the word cloudburst as opposed to just trying to describe a gigantic rainstorm with the normal adjectives you might use every day. There's this new word to that immediately brings to mind exactly what you want to talk about. So it's a very effective word. He also talks about some of the names for various cocktails that were created in America. For example, you have the whiskey and soda, which is the English name for combining whiskey and soda water. But in America, it's called the highball. We also have the words soda water and pop and soft drinks and things like that. So you can kind of get this idea that the American language has a bit of a bolder characteristic to it than the English, which makes sense given your cultural heritage. There's another interesting word actually, barbecue. That actually comes from a Haitian word that probably wouldn't really surprise people. So there are a lot of influences coming into the language from outside of English, as I mentioned earlier. So those are just a few points of interest. We could go through these examples endlessly if we wanted to.
Right. Well, I did. So before we went strictly on to Mencken's selection of American words, I did have one of the few examples where he pulled up what the English themselves thought they had to explain for it being so such a foreign Americanism that their audience wouldn't understand the word, which would be, I believe, photo 9 from the list of mine. And this just says this English writer, W.G. Faulkner, thought that it was necessary to explain the meanings of hobo, hoodlum, bunco steerer. So some of these didn't really make it to the modern American language, but others did, like deadbeat, flume, dub, rubberneck, drummer, sucker, dive, in the sense of a thieves' resort, clean up, graft, and to feature. And another interpreter closely following him added definitions of hold up, quitter, rube, shack, bandwagon, road agent, cinch, live wire, and scab. So these are words that I think most people in the Anglosphere would be readily these are words that most people in the Anglosphere would readily understand. But not so long ago, the other English-speaking peoples thought these were foreign. They were strange. But yeah, if you look at all those words, if you remember them, they're all very direct in their meaning. They're all the American words. The pattern that we will always see is that they are much more concise. They're sort of staccato. So dive, sucker. These are all things that you can say quickly, snappily. And they all give you the vivid imagery very quickly. You can kind of infer what a deadbeat is if you hear it in context. Same with a sucker. This guy's a sucker. So this was just an example that I thought would be interesting. Anything on that?
No. Why don't we pull up
Okay.
another reference?
Yeah. Okay. So this one I thought was very interesting. If we could pull up number 10, this is in a footnote, and I thought this was hilarious, so that's why I included it. I think that's a good of a criterion as any. And Mencken writes in the London Times for June 15th, 1927, George Bernard Shaw was reported as saying, "When President Wilson came to this country, he gave us a shock by using the word obligate instead of oblige. It showed that a man could become president in spite of that. And we asked ourselves if a man could become king of England if he used the word obligate. We said at once that it could not be done." So this is I found this funny for many reasons, some of which might be obvious. But the really substantive part of that footnote, I think, is the fact that Americans will just change words from their technically correct formal usage into just something else that flows better when they're speaking or writing. But it carries the same meaning. So obviously Wilson did not have to explain to these more upper crust Englishmen what obligate meant. They understood it. It was a very clear impartation of meaning, if you will. They had a uproar about it, quite clearly. George Bernard Shaw, the very subversive man that he was, strongly disliked it. So once again, just to illustrate, this is a theme that we will see with American words. They're much more direct. They kind of just emerge naturally through the spoken language, and they impart meaning very quickly, such that even people that would be appalled by it readily understand what the word means. So,
And these words did not there was not a strict delineation, because we can say, and still do say, well, thank you, I'm much obliged, so, or I'm obligated to you for the help you gave me. The words continue to exist, and I don't have the time to go into it right now live on a stream, but I expect you'll find that obligate comes out of Latin, and the obligate form has just as much claim, I'm guessing, but it's very likely it would have just as much claim to being correct coming from the Latin as oblige would. And there are other examples that just drive me up a wall. Like in Britain, many people still say, they say both. They say orient, like I orient myself to the east, or my primary orientation, so we've got orient, and then we've got orientate. And it drives me mad. The Brits say orientate, and I'm like, no, the word is orient, meaning turn towards the east, meaning establish a basis for navigating, based on the big thing in the sky that you can see during the day that rises in the east, the sun. But they'll say orientate, and so the Brit, or like to the previous example of fixing and fixed. Fix into, or enjoy these fixings. The Brits say sort. Well, let's sort it. I've got it sorted. They do precisely the same things, and it just becomes a matter of taste in many cases, whether one chooses the one approach or the other.
Right, and this is so actually we can kind of see that they recognize that some of these words are equally serviceable, if not somewhat improved. So number 11 from my collection of photos from this book, if we can pull that up real quick, it has some of their some of the more Anglophile upper crust sort of admitting that some of these Americanisms actually do get the meaning across better, and they come from a more traditional background, at least in an Anglo-Saxon sense. So this is Mencken writing. I have noted H.W. and F.G. Fowler and the King's English were deciding so long ago as 1906 that, quote, Americanisms are foreign words and should be so treated. They admitted that American had its points of superiority, and they say fall is better on the merits than autumn in every way. It is short, Saxon, like the other three season names, picturesque. It reveals its derivation to everyone who uses it, not to the scholar only, like autumn. But they protested against taking even the most impeccable Americanisms into English. The English and the American language and literature, they argued, are both good things, and they are better apart than mixed. So just reading this myself, I don't necessarily have any disagreements with their final conclusion. But even some of these literary critics will admit that the Americanisms oftentimes portray an older form of English, something that was more direct, more picturesque, more vivid. So I felt like this was complementing what we were just talking about there.
Yes, the author also points out, Mencken points out that in Appalachia in particularly, which will obviously make sense if you listen to our stream on Albion Seed, had a lot of older Scottish and Northern English words in them. Fall, of course, in this case, gets to the idea that I think Semiogogue mentioned, or it might have been you, Ryan, that our words sort of get to the point. I think it was you, Ryan. Fall gets to the point a bit better than autumn does. It's easier to say, and it describes the fact that the leaves are literally falling off the trees in autumn. So it's difficult to really levy any criticism against the word fall that makes any sense.
There's also a whole dimension of metaphor. So if you read the Odyssey, or even the parts of the Iliad, if I remember right, certainly the Odyssey, though, they'll have this metaphor, the wine dark sea. And I remember the first time that I was on a ferry going from Athens to Santorini, and I saw the way the summer sun hit the Mediterranean where I was, and it was almost purple. And you could almost see the juice of grapes, And so certain metaphors carry with them a whole constellation of associations. So when you say fall, you've got the idea of there's the seasonal aspect of it. It comes in a cycle with these four major divisions in the course of a year. And so things will spring up and then they will fall down again. And when you say fall, it much more directly connotes this idea of rising and falling in a seasonal progress. A spring, indeed, gives you this idea of bursting forward with life. And that in turn, can put us in mind of manuscript illustrations of Fortuna as a force in nature, properly positioned below God and God's will, but it's nevertheless a force that our ancestors recognized and grappled with. And you'll see, the representations of fortune turning her wheel, and it can be summarized by, I will rule, the guy who's on the upward trajectory of the wheel, and then the guy at the top of the wheel, and it says, I rule. And then the guy who's descending as the wheel goes downward, and he says, I have ruled. And then the guy at the bottom, who has fallen completely, I rule nothing. And so I perhaps went into this too much, but the idea is that a choice of a word can, in many instances, connect to whole constellations of received cultural knowledge. And if someone listens with an alert ear, there are ways in which those associations, the rich chain of associations which have come down to us through our culture or cultures, will be evoked by the choice of the word. And so we should take care in selecting those words. Those of us who care about such things should make of themselves authorities in order to argue, I believe, on behalf of one versus the other.
Yeah, this is something that I've had to become more mindful of as I write more. It's just that even the most basic of words, in terms of how common they may be invoked, can convey a lot more meaning than sometimes I intend them to. So this is probably also why I like the book, is just due to the autism about language. But this is a major point that Mencken is making, that a lot of the word differences between Americans and English really just come down to what meaning is being conveyed through them and where does the word come from. So I actually, Semiogogue, I don't think you were going too far into it at all. I think that's the essence of this book, is getting that far into it. So do we have anything more on this one?
No, there's something I particularly want to get to, but it'll probably come down the line a bit. So let's move on to the next thing you got lined up.
Yes, very quickly, if we can move on to 13. This is going to start getting into the Americans. How do they perceive themselves? And I thought this was the most representative, perhaps, something that is carried over into a lot of Americans today. So Mencken writes, the Middle West has always been the chief center of linguistic chauvinism. And so early as February 15th, 1838, the legislature of Indiana, in an act established the State University of Bloomington, provided that it should instruct the youth of the new Commonwealth, which had been admitted to the Union in 1816, quote, in the American learned and foreign languages and literature. Nearly a century later, in 1923, there was a violent upsurging of the same patriotic spirit, and bills making the American language official, but never clearly defining it, were introduced in the legislatures of Illinois, North Dakota, Minnesota, and other states. At the same time, the Honorable Washington J. McCormick, then a Republican member of the House of Representatives from Montana, offered a similar bill in Congress. And Mencken has the text of the bill, but basically it just wants to put the American language into law. So this I found interesting, because I remember when I first read through this for the first time, I thought that Mencken saying that this is an American language, he's speaking American, the Americans speak American. I thought this was sort of a like a quirky thing he was doing, some sort of stylistic choice. But no, actually, this is our history. We speak American. I remember when I was in school, if I were to have said that, I would have gotten made fun of by the educators, by the teachers. We don't speak American, we speak English. This is something that dumb Heartlanders would say, I speak American. But here it is right here, like perhaps the most talented generations of American politicians, some of the most learned people that actually reach political office, were passing bills saying that we speak the American language.
Yes, absolutely. It was the same in my time, where saying that you speak American would be treated as low class and something absurd to say. But here it is, attempted to be put into the actual law of the United States. It certainly would have been good, I think, if we had actually defined the American language as the official language of the country.
Yeah, I mean, that's unfortunately, history does not always go our way, sometimes seldom. But I am kind of happy, though, that we at least have this this sort of even just this one book to go off of. You can get a lot out of these books that we're going through, which really just show you the heritage that Americans have, in particular, that's not shared by any other people. It's a very distinct thing. The last two streams we were going over our national heritage, like which peoples did we come from, where were they, what customs did they bring over, and now this week we can see from this book what's our linguistic heritage, where did it come from, these two very basic building blocks of a nation. So, and then if we don't have anything else to go off of, I think the number 15 will be very instructive for the audience if they're wanting a more clear definition. So this is from the start, where Mencken really tries to define what an Americanism is. So this is just part of it. He says the characters chiefly noted in American English by all who have discussed it are, first, its general uniformity throughout the country. Second, its impatient disregard for grammatical, syntactical, and phonological rule and precedent. And third, its large capacity distinctly greater than that of the English of present-day England, for taking in new words and phrases from outside sources, and for manufacturing them of its own materials. So if you, the audience, are wanting to know, like, we keep talking in vague terms about the American language and all these words, but what actually is it? These are the three defining characteristics that make it distinct from other forms of English. I thought this was probably the best summary, but do you two have anything to comment on that?
Nothing to add on my end. That seems an accurate characterization, though of course the English of the English is also enormously hungry for new words. You know, the Oxford English Dictionary, limited as it is in scope to, or was limited as it was in scope to, you know, properly English, there's just an enormous number of words. You go look at other dictionaries, because I have many of them, you know, in which you can find all the various words from these other languages, and you simply don't see the number. We absolutely loot Greek, we loot Latin. We pull from, you know, that whole period of attempting to sort of, you know, move outside Latinate forms and embrace Germanic ones, you know, saying folk instead of people, or forward instead of preface. We also pull from our Germanic, or did pull from our Germanic heritage. So yeah, it's characteristic of English in general, and more properly of American, or American English.
Yeah, I mean, that's I'd have to agree. If we want to quickly move on, just to make sure we get through at least the excerpts that I had, give the audience a good overview of the book. If we can move on to 18, something that Mencken does very well is that he takes examples from a lot of people that he dislikes or thinks that are on the wrong side, perhaps the more Anglophilic types. And he writes here, I glanced through the speeches of the late Dr. Woodrow Wilson, surely a conscientious purist and Anglomaniac if we ever had one, and find in a few moments half a dozen locutions that an Englishman in like position would certainly hesitate to use. Among them, we must get a move on, to hog, to gumshoe, ornery in the place of ordinary, and that is going some. I turn to the letters of that most passionate of Anglomaniacs, Walter Hines Page, and find, to eat out of my hand, to lick to a frazzle, to cut no figure, to go gunning for, nothing doing, for keeps, and so on. So this is not to like sort of spite anyone necessarily, but just to show that even the people that would style themselves as Anglophilic, people that think that our heritage should be bound to England even to this day, even they pick up the American language and speak it, such that they don't even realize that they might be breaching the decorum of their office. They might be speaking like the barbarians back at home when they're in Europe. So this was I thought a very good example that Mencken pulled out from people that he would probably, if you asked him, would say that they're bad. They're trying to do a disservice to the American language. Even they speak the American language. I think that's a hallmark, that it is a distinct thing, to where even the people that are born and raised here but don't like it as much still speak it, even unconsciously.
Yeah, so this is a good example of some of Mencken's humor, because he is sort of roasting them there at the same time, but doing it in a rather surreptitious and very, let's say, polite way.
Yeah, that is a good point. Mencken always comes off as polite. He never comes off as uncouth, perhaps. So along this line is on number 19. Some more words that are I find interesting. Mencken writes, all this boldness of conceit, of course, makes for vulgarity, talking about the trends of the American language. Unrestrained by any critical sense, and the critical sense of the pedagogues counts for little, for they cry wolf too often. It flowers in such barbaric inventions as tasty, all right, go-getter, he-man, go-aheadativeness, Tony, goof, semi-occasional, and to doxologize. And then this is sort of Mencken providing his own opinion, but vulgarity, after all, means no more than a yielding to natural impulses in the face of conventional inhibitions, and that yielding to natural impulses is at the heart of all healthy language making. So this should not be misunderstood. If you're listening now in the audience, it's not that Mencken is some hedonist. Certainly his lifestyle would not point him to be one, but rather he's been making the point throughout this book that the American language has vitality. At the time he was writing, it was still flourishing, growing, and changing in natural ways. So that was what I wanted to bring up there.
Yeah, no, there are endless examples of this sort of thing throughout the book. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. We are an hour and 15 minutes in, so I'd like to get through some of the rest you've prepared.
Right, I am trying to see which ones we should start with. I have this one, number 21, but unfortunately I am terrible at speaking anything Latin derived, so you'll have to bear with me. But this is number 21 from the compilation. There we go. So this is Mencken talking about some of the non-English European influences on the American language, of which there are many, and a lot of them are very commonplace. And before I go on, though, he mentions just before this excerpt that even political words like caucus or caucusing are Americanisms, which I just found fascinating. I thought that would definitely have been something we imported, but not so. So Mencken writes, from the very earliest days of English colonization, the language of the settlers also received accretions from the languages of the other colonizing nations. The French word portage, for example, was already in use before the end of the 17th century, and soon after came chowder, cache, voyager, and various words that, like the last named, have since become localisms or disappeared altogether. Before the Revolution, bureau, bateau, and prairie were added, and soon after came gopher, bogus, and flume. Carriole is also French in origin, despite its English sound. It comes by folk etymology from the English carriole, so is brave in the sense of an Indian warrior. But the French themselves borrowed it from the Italian bravo. Other French terms came in after the Louisiana Purchase, and I'll just skip ahead here to the New Amsterdam Dutch because this is also very interesting. We get from the New Amsterdam Dutch such words as cruller, coleslaw, cookie, stoop, sleigh, span of horses, dope in the drug sense, and this is brought up a couple of times throughout the book, spook, to snoop, pit, as in peach pit, waffle, hook, a point of land, scow, patroon, boss, smear case, and Santa Claus. So those are all Dutchisms that we just inherited from the Dutch colony that was only so briefly here on the East Coast, which I just find fascinating, especially words like spook, dope, snooping around. It's something that I just found interesting. Any observations from that list, gentlemen?
No, it's just a good example of some of the fundamental differences between English and American in that we actually have many, many words from other European languages as a central part of our language, whereas the British do not. Of course, a lot of these are now used, ironically, in English rather than American English.
Right,
I think
and that's
any modern day English person knows what most of those words are. If you know, sure, they use many of them in their daily speech.
Right.
Yes, it also underscores the fact that our nation's founding, had a good bit more than the English involved in it. Of course, the fundamental structures and the majority of the people came from there, but the presence of the French, less so, but still the presence of the Spanish, certainly all the Dutch involved in the Northeast with the original settling, and New Amsterdam becoming New York. This was not a strictly Anglo project. And that is not, again, I want to add, I'm not claiming that it doesn't overwhelmingly bear the stamp of England, but yeah, far too often we forget about these facts, and a lot of people Anglo. I've even seen people on Twitter whom I believe are probably there just to start shit and cause problems. I mean, strictly as a matter of what they were hired to do. That's my guess. But they come in and they say, if you're not English, you need to get the hell out of the country. And I'm thinking to myself, we wouldn't have a country if the French had not almost bankrupted themselves, supporting us with a fleet and loans and things like this. And there's also that aspect of the early Dutch settlers. And it's very much on my mind because I just discovered I have ancestors who came over in 1630 with the, I believe it's the Winthrop fleet. And I've discovered I have some Dutch ancestry, which I was entirely unaware of. So our roots go back further. And yes, the primary shaping force that affected what emerged here was English, but it was not the only one.
Yeah, and this is a very important point to make on the meta level, especially. I don't think anyone can say we have underemphasized the English, especially after the last few weeks on this channel. But it's important to remember, if anyone was able to listen to last week's stream, where we went more in depth on the, especially say the Quakers in the backcountry, they have this idea of sort of like a pan-Christian republic or a pan-Christian nation that was tolerant, but specifically for the Christians approved, if you will. There's very much sort of a pan-European idea to most of America throughout its history that I've seen a lot of people sort of overcorrect when memeing and trying to craft narratives into like America is just Anglo or something to that extent, or America is just British derived, where certainly that is the foundation, but it would be a very different country if that was all we had. And in fact, if we can bring up number 22 from the list, we can go into the much derided German influence on America, where some of these are very obviously German. In fact, they all are. But it's just how long they've been in the American lexicon that I find interesting. So Mencken says before the Revolution, before the American Revolution, a few German words worked their way into American. Sauerkraut has been traced by Thornton back to 1789 and is probably much older. So are noodle and pretzel. But Lager, Bockbier, Songerfest, Kindergarten, Wienerwurst, Ratzkeller, Zwieback, and Turnverein, and so on belong to the period after 1848 and will be noticed later. Beer soup goes back to 1799, but beer garden has not been found before 1870. And this is important for me just because I use the word a lot. As I have suggested, German probably helped Dutch to put dumb in the sense of stupid in the American vocabulary. So this has come over to American throughout a long period of time. But even some of the very basic foods that Americans will eat, pretzels, noodles, sauerkraut, we all knew that they were in some sense German. It's just how long they have been in our lexicon that I think people sometimes neglect in their memeing. So anything on that?
I'd just add the number of Germans that came over was enormous. Certainly during that period, he mentions 1848, but my Timken family came over, stepped off the boat in New Orleans. This is all my mother's side, who are more recent arrivals, in 1838. And that continued up through the 1850s. Just huge numbers of Germans came in. One of the branches of my family was Germans raising cattle in East Texas. There's the Timkins. They went north and founded that roller bearing company. Unfortunately, that was one of the brothers of my ancestors, so I didn't see any of that money. But there are just huge numbers of them that came in. And prior to the subversions of the British bringing us into World War I through the Anglo-maniacs in the Northeast, who, from very early on wanted to sort of covertly reestablish our relationships with Britain, this country had a very pro-German sentiment, which had to be very carefully eroded and subverted in order to bring us in on the side of the British in World War I. And then later for World War II, there were just huge numbers of Germans here. One of my German ancestors, the same cattle family from East Texas, he was at the siege of Vicksburg. A lot of people don't understand that many of these Germans came over and fought for the South The German Creoles along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico are well known. But again, this is just another one of these aspects that we often forget when we think about what our country is. And to some extent, I believe that really does come down to this same, I know I keep hammering on it like a madman, but this same desire of the Yankee in the Northeast. Remember the Yankees who basically tried to avoid sending any troops to help the Virginians and others in the South fighting against the British in the War of 1812. They just said, yeah, we're not sending men. We kind of prefer if we ended up in the control of Britain again. So we've had this division in our country for some time, and those Anglo-maniacs have succeeded in reshaping our understanding of our own national history. Again, this is not to say that by far the primary stamp that shaped us as a country is English. There's no argument from me there. But these other aspects somehow get lost like tears in the rain.
Yes, all good points, I think. Anything to add, Charlie? Because I was thinking we might lightning round some of the word selections I have.
Good, yeah, let's do that.
Okay, yeah, so like I said, I'll just go through this in a sort of lightning manner because I think we've made a lot of the meta level points that there are to make. There's a couple remaining, but just so that the audience can get a taste of what words are American and what aren't. If we can pull up number 23, and I'll just read this off and we can sort of marvel at the genius of American language, the American language. Mencken writes, upon men of this sort fell the task of bringing the wilderness to the axe and the plow, and with it went the task of inventing a vocabulary for the special needs of the great adventure, so the American language adapted with the frontier. Out of their loutish ingenuity came a great number of picturesque names for natural objects, chiefly boldly descriptive compounds: bullfrog, mudhen, catbird, catfish, muskrat, razorback, garter snake, groundhog, and so on. And out of an inventiveness somewhat more urbane came such coinages as live oak, potato bug, turkey gobbler, sweet potato, canvasback, pokeweed, copperhead, eelgrass, reed bird, eggplant, bluegrass, katydid, peanut, pitch pine, clingstone, June bug, lightning bug, and butternut. So those are some very earthy American words that only exist because the English descended peoples had to live out here. And then if we can go on to, I believe it's number 24, we can get some less earthy but still innovative words from around the same time period. So Webster, though he agreed with Franklin in opposing to advocate, gave his imprimatur to appreciate, i.e. to rise in value, and to obligate, and is credited by Sir Charles Lyell as having himself claimed the invention of to demoralize. In a letter to Thomas Dawes, dated August 5th, 1809, he said that he had also, quote, enriched the vocabulary with absorbable, accompaniment, acidulous, achromatic, adhesiveness, adjutancy, admissibility, advisory, amenable, animalize, aneurysmal, antithetical, appellar, appreciate, appreciation, and then he just keeps going: aberrization, ascertainable, bailey, bailment, endorser, endorsee, prescriptive, statement, insubordination, subsidize. So all of these words that many of us use. I'm sure if you go back to all of our streams, we've used most of the words we brought up today so far, except the ones that were 1920 slang. I find it amazing that to appreciate, as in to go up in value, is an Americanism. This very core word in finance and anything to do with money is itself an Americanism. Same with ascertainable, antithetical. So this is all, I think, very indicative that the American language has been important, not just for the Americans, but especially for us. Anything with that?
Not from my end, nope.
Okay.
No, it speaks for itself, really.
I will skip 25. If we can go to 26, this will sort of introduce us to another type of Americanism. So this is Mencken writing. Most of the colonists who lived along the American seaboard in 1750 were the descendants of immigrants who had come in fully a century before. After the first settlements there had been much less fresh immigration. Sorry, it's somewhat hot in this room. After the first settlements, there had been much less fresh immigration than many latter-day writers have assumed. According to Prescott F. Hall, the population of New England at the date of the Revolutionary War was produced out of an immigration of about 20,000 persons who arrived before 1640. So this is included because it's going to explain the archaicisms in American, but also I think that's sort of a white pill. You can just create a nation out of 20,000 people if you actually want to, and if you believe in it. Some sort of a white pill, at least to me. And it keeps going on number 27 from the list that I have here, where Mencken keeps going. The total population of the colonies in 1751, then about 1 million, had been produced from an original immigration of less than 80,000. Even at that early day, indeed, the colonists had begun to feel that they were distinctly separated in culture and customs from the mother country, and there were signs of the rise of a new native aristocracy, entirely distinct from the older aristocracy of the royal governor's courts. So this is trying to explain why the Americans might have archaicisms. And it's because we did not have like a large representative immigrant body from England. As we talked about in the last couple of weeks, they came from very specific places and mostly kept their regional peculiarities when they got over here. And I'll just skip somewhat down here. This is Mencken writing again. Nor was there any very extensive exchange of ideas, for though most of the books read in the colonies came from England, the great majority of the colonists, down to the middle of the century, seem to have read little save the Bible and biblical commentaries, and in the native literature of the time, one seldom comes upon any reference to the English authors who were glorifying the period of the Restoration and the reign of Anne. And this is very important because a lot of American conservatives today, to try to sort of overinflate the sort of English nature of America, this is what Mencken records. No allusion to Shakespeare, says Bliss Perry, has been discovered in the colonial literature of the 17th century, and scarcely an allusion to the Puritan poet Milton. Benjamin Franklin's brother, James, had a copy of Shakespeare at the New England Courant Office in Boston, but Benjamin himself seems to have made little use of it, for there's not a single quotation from or mention of the bard in all of his voluminous works. So, I remember it's a very doctrinaire conservative line to say that, like, America has inherited a great culture on the lines of Shakespeare and Milton from Europe. Mencken is here to say that's not true. You can find a lot of the King James Bible from the early Americans, and that has most certainly influenced its language. But Shakespeare and Milton, comparatively less important. So I think that's very important to bring up here. Sort of something against modern conservatism, certainly.
It actually is, and even against people within our own intellectual sphere, I think overemphasize the importance of what might be called in this case the English canon. Nick Land does this, and people who are follow his lines of thought tend to do this as well, where these books are treated as some sort of essential essence of the American people. Arguably, in some ways they are, but definitely we can say, at least in my opinion, we can definitely say that they are overemphasized in terms of how central these texts are to us. As described here, it's the Bible more so than Shakespeare or Milton that is essential to the American people. Not that these things aren't important, but of course, this is what you would study in any public school curriculum. The fact that I use public school, that's actually different than how the English would use that word, but Americans understand what that means. This is actually mentioned in the book, which is why I bring that up. But yeah, Shakespeare and Milton are heavily emphasized, but that's, I think, tying us too closely to the English in a sort of retroactive way.
Yeah, and people should remember, of course, Christians know very well, and this is a subject that Ryan knows quite a bit more about than I do. But the Great Awakenings and the revivals And this wasn't, the kind of thing that was limited to Puritans in the 17th century. You could go as far away as like the wilds of Arkansas and find, people gathering together by night to pray in huge crowds around bonfires as a part of revivals. The degree to which this country and the expansion across it was Christian is something that many Christians still know today, but particularly Americans of more recent vintage and ones who perhaps aren't Christian, they're not aware of that. I mean, this country was so Christian, in fact, that it became a magnet for all sorts of people. I mean, this is obvious, but it's worth saying. It became a magnet for Christians who wanted to worship in relative freedom. And so that aspect of our cultural heritage, and certainly down to literacy, that is something that we should all bear very much in mind.
Right, especially
Yes.
for the. Oh, sorry, go on.
Well, yes, the literacy of the backcountry peoples, for example, as we discussed in Albion Seed, was actually much higher than most people reckon. It was very common, actually, for people to read the Bible. And to the extent that Christianity is attacked today, it really constitutes an attack on the most foundational aspect of America itself. The most foundational aspect of America is not actually the English heritage, but the Christian heritage. And I think that's made very clear in the studies we made of the groups that we discussed during our Albion Seed streams. And I think will be made clear next week with the book we discuss as well.
Yes, and this is a very important, and that's not to denigrate the specific European heritage either. It's just that is the one thing that they all had in common. In fact, actually, if we can pull up number 29 from the catalog here, Mencken actually elaborates on this, just how imperative the Bible was for the American language. So he says, still on the Shakespeare point, Mencken says, there was obviously only rhetoric in James Russell Lowell's saying that, quote, our ancestors unhappily could bring over no English better than Shakespeare's. For relatively few of them had ever heard of Shakespeare, and to even fewer was he anything more than a vague name. But it is nevertheless a fact that their way of using the language had something in it of his glorious freedom and spaciousness. If they had any written guide, it was the King James Bible, 1611. Whenever an English reform or innovation percolated to them, they were inclined to remain faithful to the sacred text, not only because of its pious authority, but also because of its superior pull, of its imminent and constant presence. Thus, when fashionable prudery in English ordered the abandonment of the Anglo-Saxon sick for the later and more elegant ill, the colonists refused to follow, for sick was in both the Old Testament and the New, and that refusal remains in force to this day. So if you want to know why is it that Americans say sick instead of ill and Brits say ill instead of sick, it is specifically because the colonists over here in America held by the language that was used in the King James Bible. It is perhaps the single most important document for understanding Americans as they existed throughout their history. Anything there before we move on?
No argument there. None at all.
So we do have some Shakespeareisms, actually. If we can pull up number 30, this is something I just found interesting because these words were kind of just fundamental to things I study. In Measure for Measure, Aeschylus says, I guess not, to Angelo. The Oxford Dictionary offers examples much older, from Chaucer, Wycliffe, and Gower. To loan, in the American sense of to lend, is in 34 and 35 of Henry VIII, but it dropped out of use in England early in the 18th century, and all the leading dictionaries in both English and American now call it an Americanism, that is, to loan. To fellowship, once in good American use but now reduced to provincialism, is in Chaucer. Even to hustle, it appears, is ancient. Among adjectives, homely was used in its American sense of plain-featured by both Shakespeare and Milton. Other such survivors are burly, catty-cornered, likely, deft, copious, scant, and ornate. Perhaps clever also belongs to this category, that is, in the American sense of amiable. So, we've already established the colonists and the Americans were not specifically reading Shakespeare and Milton, yet they carry over the language that they wrote in and spoke. I think this is perhaps the greatest part of the book, the greatest testament that the American language is in a sense much older than the other forms of English in use today. So that was what I wanted to emphasize. If you guys had anything, I'd be interested in hearing it.
Well, there was something I wanted to get to in particular on page 273, or really there's a whole chapter on this, but page 273, there's particular references. It's honorifics. I don't know if either of you found that interesting, but I was interested in the honorifics in particular because one of the major differences I noticed on the rather large section, I think it's like part 6 or 7 or something. Yes, I think it's part 6. One of the major differences between American and English is the attention paid to honorifics. The English tend to reserve them much more in their speech, whereas the Americans tend to use them much more, shall we say, liberally. For example, doctor is one of them. In England, doctor is an honorific given to a very particularly trained person, whereas in the United States, what is the example he uses? Like chiropractors, you might call just a doctor ipso facto, dang it, ipso facto, a chiropractor would be called a doctor. There's also the word professor, which is used much less frequently in England, whereas in America at the time, I think it's probably less true now, but actually it's even less true in Menken's time. In Menken's time, he pointed out how prior 2 or 3 generations ago from when he lived, that pretty much any type of professional might be called a professor. He mentions barbers and bartenders, phrenologists, that's funny. But in England, it's reserved for very particular people, and additionally, certain professorial appointments entitled one to being having the right honorable placed before your name. He mentioned he postulates that perhaps this is why the English universities hand out less honorary degrees, because it would necessarily bring with it those additional honorifics. There's also military titles, so he comments on how sergeants would never be promoted but to all the way up to the rank of colonel by their acclamations, that's just unknown in England at the time. You also wouldn't have the title, colonels and generals used on the staff of governors or other organizations like Knights Templar and Patriarchs Militant. I'm not actually familiar with that second organization. Also in England, a railway conductor would never be called a captain, although you might use that term in the United States. Additionally, the police would never use military terms in Great Britain, as you might refer to a police sergeant or a police colonel or captain in the United States, and things like that. So there's also a section on how senator or ex-senator is applied in the United States. There's a bit on the use of the article the. So in Great Britain, you would say the honorable, the right honorable, but in the United States, you might just say honorable and president instead of the president. In fact, the president himself, that was the honorific. This is probably a fact a lot of people know, but the honorific to be applied to the president was debated in the U.S. It was decided that only what was in the Constitution should be used. You might also say, in Great Britain or England, rather, you might say the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, the Foreign Secretary, whereas here we might say Secretary Rubio, or you tend to use people's names following the particular title that they are responsible for at the time. Whereas in England, you would simply refer to the office itself because there's more focus on the station rather than the person. And these go on to quite some extent. Did you guys have any particular ones you'd like to point out, or any other comments to add on honorifics?
I just found the use of professor to be quite interesting because that's of course it was a title that could be superseded by other titles. I think Minkin points that out. But in America, you very like sometimes you call someone a professor, but it just gets extended so far that it's not nearly as such a strong term. If I remember correctly, I think the title of professor also fell out of use in Europe, but remained in America. I may have that backwards, but I recall reading about this in another book that was also kind of interesting, just because I was wondering why the culture around professor in particular was so stringent. But it doesn't shock me that it shows a broader trend in the differences between American and English, in which English focuses on the station or the office, America on the man or the person that actually did the thing. So I don't really have much to add.
The only thing I'd
Yes,
throw
I
in
mean-
there is that. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead. I was just going to add a little bit more, Professor.
Well, these go back to education within a Catholic hierarchy, ultimately. So a doctor is one learned in the church. And of course, early universities that were run, where you would study, or a doctor of law, right? So you went to Heidelberg, right? And you learned canon law, and then you would go on from there to, understand the different continental legal systems that were tied to canon law in many respects, because of how all of that developed. To profess, as I often talk about, is of a piece with other words like confess. So to profess a faith is very much a religious term. But what happened in the United States is that because we were not fond, for the most part, of centralized hierarchies as regards religion, and with this heavy Protestant emphasis, outside of places like Maryland, you ended up with much less of anything that resembled a priesthood. And so these words began to be employed for things that were not considered strictly religious. We'd refer to a pastor or a deacon or a reverend, but not a doctor of the church, or someone professing a particular creed. Though I'm sure if you look at early Protestant texts, you'll find profess. But I bring all of this up because we now have a sort of post-Christian, and in some respects even a post-secular, and by that I mean that we're returning to a religious aspect while remaining entirely ignorant of what we're doing. We have a priesthood, as I've mentioned many times before. This will probably bore the shit out of Charlemagne, but we have a priesthood that still speaks dog Latin, and they get called professors and doctors, and they're considered the white collar professions. And of course, people say, well, that's because you have a nice white shirt. Well, yes, you also had a collar you attached. And so the idea there is that we have lost the continental European idea of a hierarchy in religion and a caste of priests. And now we project that onto our public health establishment and the other mumblers of Latin who are responsible for being the wise ones to whom we turn when we need direction. So lawyers who speak bad Latin, and economists, and physicians, the so-called professional class, which still treats you whenever you go to them as though you are some kind of I haven't had a lawyer yet who doesn't speak to me as though he's doing me a favor in the course of accepting the large amount of money I'm paying him. Likewise, physicians are, many of them are insufferably snotty and they read the signs for you about the future and what will happen. You know, they recommend lifestyle decisions. You know, go home and, you know, ride your exercise bike and remove salt from your diet and say 3 Hail Marys. So we've got this sort of strange sort of amnesia as regards the origins of these things, and I think that's worth thinking about. You know, as regards words like doctor and professor.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to wrap up on. Are you prepared to wrap up right now, Ryan? Get just some
If you
super chats.
could, if you could give me one last lightning round, I feel like
Yeah,
I have
no, we've
one
got-
more collection of words.
We've got time.
So, okay, if we could pull up number 31, and I'll just read through this so the audience can fully enjoy the American language. That is number 31 from the catalog. So, a great rage for extending the vocabulary by the use of suffixes seized upon the corn-fed etymologists, and they produced a formidable new vocabulary in eyes, ate, ify, see, us, and meant. Such inventions as to concertize, to questionize, retiracy, savagerous, coty, and citified appeared in the popular vocabulary and even got into more or less respectable usage. Fowler in 1850 cited publishment and releasement with no apparent thought that they were uncouth. And at the same time, many verbs were made by the simple process of back formation, as to resurrect, to excirt, to resolute, to burgle, and to enthuse. Some of these inventions, after flourishing for a generation or more, were retired with blushes during the period of plush elegance following the Civil War, but a large number have survived to our own day. Not even the most meticulous purist would think of objecting to affiliate, to endorse, to collide, to jeopardize, to predicate, to itemize, to resurrect, or to Americanize today. And yet all of them gave grief to the judicious when they first appeared in the debates of Congress, brought there by statesmen from the backwoods. So last stream, when we kept talking about how the backcountry produced some of the most influential men that the country has ever seen, they changed the language as well in ways that are commonly accepted both here and in the rest of the English-speaking world. If we can bring up number 32 real quick, I think this one's going to be somewhat entertaining. This is Mencken once again, talking about American phrases such as to fill the bill, to fizzle out, to make tracks, to peter out, to plank down, to go back on, to keep tab, to light out, and to back water. Side by side with them, we have inherited such common coins of speech as to make the fur fly, to cut a swath, to know him like a book, to keep a stiff upper lip, something that I always thought was a British saying, is credited as an Americanism by Mencken. To cap the climax, to handle without gloves, to freeze onto, to go it blind, to pull wool over his eyes, to have the floor, to know the ropes, to get solid with, to spread oneself, to run into the ground, to dodge the issue, to paint the town red, to take a back seat, and to get ahead of. All of these are American phrases. And then as we moved west, we get to pan out, to strike it rich, to jump or enter a claim on, to pull up stakes, to rope in, to die with one's boots on, to get the deadwood on, to get the drop, to back and fill, to do a land office business, and to get the bulge on. And then we get also to kick the bucket, to put a bug in his ear, to see the elephant, and he keeps going. And then last but not least, if we pull up number 35, we get some words that have had changes in definition. So docket, meaning a court calendar, these are all new definitions that the Americans gave the word. Betterment, for improvement to property. Collateral, for security. Crank, for fanatic. Jumper, for tunic. Backbone, for moral courage. Tickler, for memorandum or reminder. Carnival, and such phrases as carnival of crime. Scrape, for fight or difficulty. Flurry, of snow or in the market. Suspenders, diggings for habitation, and range. And then again, there were new workings of English materials like doggery, rowdy, teetotaler, goatee, Tony, cussedness. And then we get completely fabricated words like sockdolager. I'm not familiar with that one. Hunky dory, scalawag, and then a lot of these that are just crazy. Rambunctious, scrumptious, skedaddle, absquatulate, and exfluncticate. So some of these that haven't survived to my usage, but
Yeah,
those are...
abscotulate means to take off, to run.
Oh, okay. All right, that makes sense then. All right. So those were the last little sections of words that I thought would be very interesting for the audience. I remember the first time I read this book, Stiff Upper Lip, I was shocked at that being an Americanism. So, but maybe there were other words in here that the audience would also be equally as shocked at. So that's all I've got.
I wanted to say one last very quick word, if I may.
Yes.
It's that you have to understand it's your language. It's yours, but you've inherited it. So it comes down to you as a legacy that is now yours, and it's your responsibility to carry it forward to the future. And I know it sounds strange, it's yours. But one of the most significant realizations that I was ever affected by was that it's mine. It's my fucking language. Excuse my French. It's mine. And I will not suffer it to be abused. And we have the old expressions like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't innovate where it's proper. Certainly in your attempts to avoid picking up expressions given to you, cut out of whole cloth. How shall I say this? There are ways in which you can create your own new metaphors and expressions without violating the lexicon. So, there, you don't have to create a word like belittle, which, as I read in Mencken, people got upset about across the pond. You can just come up with new metaphors. There's a way of looking at your language, being conscious of it when you realize it really is yours. And there is no authority other than you if you aspire to that position. And at that point, you become what Mencken himself was. He is known for his own style and the excellence of his writing, although, by the best contemporary British standards, it's too full of ornaments. It's not straightforward enough. It's not utilitarian enough. But what I'm trying to get at is that it's up to you, the listener, to master your own language, to understand what it is and where it came from, and how it should be spoken beautifully and written beautifully and used to the greatest effect. It's something that you yourself must master. The language, like the country, is yours. It must be understood as being specifically yours. And at that point, you become someone who can transmit it to the future generations and someone who can protect it from the various depredations it's currently suffering. So yeah, understand that this language is yours.
Excellent. That is a perfect closing statement and leaves me with 2 minutes to try and close out, hit our arbitrary 2-hour mark. So with that, thank you, Semiogogue, for joining us and providing your contributions to this stream. And of course, Ryan as well for providing the screenshots for us this time as well. Now, for next week, we're going to be covering the book Creating the Commonwealth, The Economic Culture of Puritan New England by Stephen Innes. And then the following 2 books, if you want to try and pick one to get ahead with, is The Flowering of New England by Van Wyck Brooks. That's Wyck spelled with a W-Y-C-K. Van Wyck Brooks, The Flowering of New England. And then following that, I believe I have the order correct, The Frontier in American History by Frederick Jackson Turner. So that's what we have lined up for the next 3 weeks following this one, if you want to pick up one of those books and read ahead. So with that, thank you both for coming on, and perhaps I will see at least one of you on Mr. D Space. And oh yeah, super chats.
Yeah.
We only have 3, so they're actually kind of funny. So Christopher Burks for $5 says, their butt hurt because our empire went to the moon and theirs didn't. Certainly true. And then he corrects himself up with a star because he spelled theirs. Well, I'm sure it was autocorrect. He spelled theirs with the there for a place, THERE''S. But he did spend $2 to correct himself. We very much appreciate that. I'm sure Mr. Mencken appreciates your correction. Blood Base just sends us $9.99. Thank you very much for the contribution. And Machiavelli sucks. White is being great, or Machiavelli sucks. Being white is great. Just gives us a white thumbs up for $4.99. Thank you very much for supporting the show, gentlemen.